We're in York County near Historic Brattonsville, and I'm speaking with Robert Carter. We are standing outside in a prairie, and you specialized in longleaf, and when we read about from the early explorers and all, we hear how open everything was and all of that. But here, I don't see a single longleaf, so this must be a different sort of prairie situation. And why is that?
Well, there's two major factors. There's fire, and then there's the soil. And then you could maybe add in animals. There's some arguments about that. So the fire regime here, which is how often you burn naturally, longleaf has to have it, and that's about every 1 to 3 years on the coastal plain.
Okay.
Here, it was about every 3 to 5 years
Oh.
that it would burn. And it was typically caused by lightning. Later on, the Native Americans learned that it was very beneficial, so then they would burn some. But even before the Native Americans, there were places like this that were just kind of open and prairie or savanna-like. A savanna is a prairie with scattered trees.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it goes back to the soils that are here. Because the soils here are what we call mafic, and that has to do with magnesium. That's the May part.
Yes.
Then the Fic part has to do with iron, ferrous. So
right.
mafic means that there's high magnesium, high iron, and it makes a clay that is dark. So it's not like a red clay. It's darker.
Huh.
Yeah, and it's the pH is higher. In the Piedmont, expect pH to be 3 to 4. Around here, in these mafic soils, it's 4 to 5, maybe even 6 sometimes.
Whoa.
So it changes, the dynamics of the soil and the nutrients in the soil. So then it changes the species that would be here.
We're in the Piedmont, but this is flat as a tabletop.
Yeah.
Why is that?
It's because it's developed from gabbro and olivine. Those are the parent materials the rock it developed from. Much of the rock in the Piedmont came from granitic type rocks, granites. That's not what this soil came from. The mafic soil is developed from the gabbro, and it's just really tough to break down. So it ended up making these kind of flat hills.
Oh.
And when fire would get started on the flat hill, it would just kind of go across it. So when you come to the Piedmont, you think of the rolling hills, but when you get to a place like this, it's almost like you're in the prairie out west, because it's kind of flat.
Mm-hmm. And we have historical records of people who came through and talked about it, and talked about some interesting animals they saw too.
Yeah, even back to 1540 when De Soto came through the Piedmont, he described prairies. And in 1701, when John Lawson came through this area, and he talked about going through like 25 miles of prairie. People can't imagine that now. And he also talked about seeing bison everywhere. So there are herds of bison, and there were elk here. And those also helped to maintain the prairie, because they would feed on the little saplings, tree saplings that were coming up, and the bison, they can knock over small trees. So they were all part of maintaining this as a prairie. Now, people just don't realize that this was a much different world. You didn't have a squirrel going from the coast to the Mississippi River through the trees. There were these open areas with bison, and really, really dynamic, and you have species that have adapted to dwell and depend on these prairie areas.
And the one species that we're here particularly to talk about today is the sunflower with the unusual name.
Yeah, Schweinitz sunflower, named after the Moravian pastor who was also liked plants. And it's fire dependent. It needs the fire to keep the environment open, because it needs the full sunlight, but it also needs its seed to reach bare soil. And fire kind of plays that role, because in the Piedmont we naturally had bunch grasses like you got right here, this broom sedge, and the fire would come through here, and in between the bunches of grass you would have the bare soil. So then the seeds could land there, and they could get start their life.
And they survive the fire fine as an intact plant.
That's right, because they have tubers underground that almost like a little small sweet potato. So after the fire comes through, they have enough carbohydrate stored that they can just sprout back the next year. They can actually spread to some degree through those tubers. It's very slow, but a bunch of Schweinitz sunflower can slowly spread. Seeds is the best way though. It's an endangered species. It's only found in York County, Lancaster County, then a few counties in North Carolina. And it's kind of specializes on these kind of prairie-like areas. Only place you find it really anymore is I think there's 24 habitats or 24 populations they've identified. And outside of that, they're just little scattered plants along the road. I'll see them sometimes. They'll be in power lines. So they have very few populations, and then the populations aren't connected at all. So that's why they're considered endangered, is they just don't have the appropriate habitat anymore.
Are there other plants that you find in this community or other animals that are specialized?
Well, there's Georgia aster. That's another one of these species that is kind of prairie, or they say post-oak savanna dependent. So it kind of has a similar niche, and it's become very rare. It's found in a few states in the South, and in any of those states is very limited, and in the Piedmont. And then there's also birds.
Birds?
And, you know, we got the quail. People know about the quail,
yeah,
and it goes
sense.
in between the bunch grass. But then we have like backbone sparrow. It nests at the bottom of the bunch grass.
Sparrows nest on the ground?
Oh yeah.
I didn't realize that.
It happens. Nature will fool you sometimes. And then there's a grasshopper sparrow, which is an appropriate name because it likes to be in these kind of areas with grasshoppers. And loggerhead shrike, the butcher bird. You know, it needs these open areas so we can find the grasshoppers so we can impale them, save us, have lunch later, basically.
Okay. And y'all, I see there are a lot of things in here that we'd like to eliminate. And y'all have plans to try to start doing controlled burns on a regular basis when all the conditions are correct.
Yeah, when the conditions are right. Hopefully this winter we're going to put a burn through here. And that will knock back a lot of this. It'll knock back most of the trees. Now, this one here, the shortleaf is one of the few pines that will sprout back. And that's an adaptation to fire, because in early descriptions, they talked about blackjack oak and post oak in these areas, but also shortleaf pine. But it's going to knock back anything. We got some sweet gum out here. It'll knock that back, and so it's going to make sure it stays an open area and remains a prairie.
And also, we'll leave some of those, get rid of some of these other grasses and leave some of those barriers so that when those wonderful sunflowers set seed next year, then they'll get a chance to land on bare soil.
That's right.
Yeah, a seed that says, "Don't be nice to me."
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm glad y'all are being nice to the Schweinitz sunflowers here, and we look forward to coming back and seeing it in a different time of the year and different phase.
Okay.